going for, and you probably have to indicate that it's okay with you. So welcome everyone. It's a delight to be with you virtually. And we're going to have a session about Kabbalah. And a moment ago, I asked, what are people's interests? And one of the questions is, why all the celebrities? And I would say, even beyond that, why the interest in spirituality and mysticism? And I remember asking this actually in a Kabbalah class, and the teacher, who is Professor, Rabbi, Dr. Arthur Green, commented that in the last century, the 20th century, there was sort of a naive expectation that the progress of science would solve all of our problems. And as you may have noticed, it didn't quite work out that way. So he at least speculated, and it makes sense to me, that people have gotten more and more interested in mysticism and spirituality and magic and things as a way of addressing those needs. And our needs aren't strictly scientific. I think, as you know, I'm a physicist and a rabbi, so I'm interested in both ends. But that was his comment. Any other questions that you'd like me to focus on or discuss as we proceed?
Why are you supposed to be over 40 to study?
Okay, we are going to talk about that. That one's in a slide. Any other comments or questions?
Any questions about mysticism?
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah.
Okay, so I am going to start sharing the screen, and somebody give me a thumbs up and let me know that you can see it. Great. Okay, so here we go. Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. And as I mentioned, I have a website, and I have some material on this. And actually, I've been working with a website expert, and I've improved it a little bit. So if you go to my main page, which is just lotger.com, there's a page for classes. I know you can't necessarily read this. And then a menu will drop down, and one of the choices is Jewish mysticism. And the first item on that list is this introduction to Kabbalah. And in addition to videos of a 3-session version of the course, and in the next day or so, I'll have the recording of this class up. There's also copies of all the slides for the extended class. So that these are PowerPoint slides, so there'll be copies of all those slides, a list of suggested readings, a learner's guide to blessings, and more. Okay, so as we get started, I think you know this, but I just want to focus that the main issue in Judaism is not what you're supposed to believe, but what you're supposed to do. What we call what you're supposed to do, commandments, not suggestions. And they, in Hebrew, are called mitzvah, singular mitzvah, plural mitzvot. Jews count 613 of them just in the Torah, the first 5 books, and includes, of course, the Big Ten, and then a bunch that are very important both in Judaism and Christianity, but are not part of the Big Ten, like love your neighbor, and of course for pay wages promptly, and for Jews, don't eat pork, other dietary disciplines. The other thing is that for Judaism, the focus is on this world much more than the next world. When Jews and Christians both use the term salvation, often Christians are talking about salvation in the next world, in heaven. For Jews, salvation is almost a political issue, namely what we're supposed to do, what our assignment is in this world. And by the way, I'm not quite sure how many people are there at the synagogue, but if you have questions, I don't mind being interrupted. So if you have something compelling, or in particular, if something I'm saying is not clear, feel free to jump in. In fact, that makes it much more interesting, I think, for everyone, including me. So the word introduction to Kabbalah. The word Kabbalah means received, referring to the received tradition. The goal is to get closer to God and even cleave to God, to become one with God. It is built on top of Judaism. It's not an alternative to Judaism. it's a deeper and deeper practice. And I would say for a Kabbalist, and I am not one, I'm a student of Kabbalah, but not a practicing Kabbalist. You begin with Orthodox Judaism, and then you go deeper. How can I become even more responsive to God than simply being a traditional Orthodox Jew? And then, the comment, Greg, that you mentioned, pop Kabbalah, which we hear a lot about, is pop spirituality. We have Madonna, we have tattoos, red strings. But just as wearing a stethoscope doesn't make you a doctor, putting on a red string or this Kabbalah water, there's all kinds of crazy stuff associated with Kabbalah, doesn't make you a Kabbalist. So it's not supposed to be easy. If you think you're going to understand it at the end of this discussion, go get ready for the Super Bowl. I have to tell you, for a lot of this material, I have to hear it like 10 times before I begin to get it. So for some of you, this may be the 4th or 5th time, and some of you may be the first time, for some of you, maybe the 25th time. So it's not supposed to be easy or understandable. It was traditionally studied only, and there was a question about this, by married male scholars over 40. And the idea there is, first, a level of maturity, and separately, a connection with the world. If you're married and you have children, you are going to resist the temptation just to go to the top of the mountain and chant blessings for 24 hours a day. There are some mystical traditions of being monastic and just praying and fasting and so on. Judaism really doesn't embrace that idea. In order to fulfill the commandments, you are tied to this world. And so traditionally it was felt that people needed a level of maturity and attachment to the world to engage in this material. People of high moral standards, prior rabbinic learning, mental and emotional stability, and traditionally it was studied one-on-one with a teacher. So rather than a class like this, and was studied one-on-one for fear that things might be misunderstood. So if you're studying one-on-one, there's more opportunity and interaction to be sure you're not going to be misunderstood. And of course, my goal is just an introduction and an orientation. So first question, is it Kabbalah or Kabbalah? And the answer is both. Kabbalah is the Ashkenazi way of pronouncing the word, like we say Shabbos or Talis. And Ashkenazim are Jews of Eastern European origin, about 95% or so of American Jews. And Kabbalah is the Sephardic way of pronouncing it, like Shabbat or Talit. And Sephardim are Jews of Spanish and Middle Eastern origin. And generally, people started pronouncing Hebrew with the Sephardic pronunciation, I would say, after the Six-Day War in Israel, as a way of being more aligned with Israel. When I went to Hebrew school a long time ago, we learned the Ashkenazi pronunciation, and since then, most synagogues use the Sephardic pronunciation. I'm sure I talked about this at the High Holidays, because I like to be clear about the difference between magic and mystic. Whoops, we lost Ann. Magic suggests that if I follow all the commandments perfectly, pray correctly, use ritual objects, keep kosher, mezuzahs, and so on, I can get God to do my will. If I'm going to be very obedient, and God will give me, good fortune, my kid won't get sick, and so on. Mystic suggests if you follow the same list, it's a matter of internal discipline, so that not that God will do my will, but I will do God's will. And although it may sound similar, it's very different. The idea, I would say the Kabbalistic idea, is that our job is to heal the world, and we heal the world by doing God's will. And while I'm talking about magic, I always like to talk about abracadabra. You've heard that word, I'm sure. I bet you didn't know it was Aramaic. Avracadabra means I create as I speak. And the verb bara here means to create, but it's only used in the Bible for God's creation. As in the second word of the Bible, Bereshit bara Elohim, God created. in the beginning. So abracadabra might be thought of what God said just before creation. Abracadabra, I create as I speak. And of course, as we know, the Torah text, God creates through speaking. So Jewish spirituality, a distinction of Jewish spirituality is it focuses on sacred texts. The presumption is that the Bible and other sacred texts, Talmud, Zohar, and so on, are infinitely rich and infinitely deep in meaning. So the way we become more spiritual, the way we become more connected with God is to dig deeper and deeper and deeper into sacred texts, thinking of these texts like a singular love letter from God that we read over and over again. And I'm going to give you some illustrations of how we dig into texts and learn more and more from them, even to get hidden messages. So we begin with the beginning of the Torah. If we opened up a Torah scroll to the beginning, it would look a lot like this, reading Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz, and so on. And so it is traditional, actually, to have the first letter of the Torah be enlarged. It's an enlarged bet, and we're going to see a couple of reasons for that. But one that's easy to see here is if I focus on, here comes Anne again, if I focus on this letter, I see it's only open this way, which means I can't ask what happens before the bet. I can't ask what happens above the bet. I can't ask what happens below the bet. All knowledge, all wisdom, all learning is going to be going in this direction, in the direction of the Torah. So even the shape of the letter bet is there to teach us things. That's the thing I just mentioned. And of course, physicists would say the same thing of the Big Bang. You can ask a question, what happened before the Big Bang, but it's not a meaningful question. Time begins with the Big Bang, so there is no before the Big Bang. But it's also the letter bet is the second letter of the alphabet, the alphabet. And as we'll see in a moment, the Hebrew letters have numbers, and not surprisingly, the letter bet is the number 2. So one of the messages, deep kind of secret message, is that there are 2 Torahs, and we talk about this a lot. Hopefully I spoke about it during high holidays. We talk about a written Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and an oral Torah, which gives rise to the Talmud. I probably spoke about this because I speak about it all the time. We can't simply translate the Torah, the Bible. The first words of the Bible present a grammatical problem. The first words of the Bible are Bereshit bara Elohim, which is often translated in the beginning God created. Sometimes it's translated in the beginning of God's creation. No matter what translation you use, it's not literal because there's a grammatical error. If we wanted to say in the beginning, we would say Barishana. That's how you say in the beginning. Bereshit is half of an expression. According to the rules of Hebrew grammar, following the word Bereshit, we need a noun. It means in the beginning of, and now we need a noun. But the second word is not a noun, it's bara. It means he created, God created. It's a verb. So I often say, maybe God wasn't so good at Hebrew grammar. Maybe that's the problem. I have great sympathy for that because I'm not very good at Hebrew or English grammar for that matter. But of course, the rabbis of our tradition would never say that. So Rashi summarizes it by saying, God was teaching us that we just can't translate. We have to interpret. If we try to translate literally, we get stuck between word 1 and word 2. And it occurs to me that God puts this lesson very early in the Torah for those of us whose attention wanders a little bit and might miss it. So another deep look at text about creation. It says, V'yomer Elohim na'aseh adam b'tzelmenu kidmutenu. And God said, let us, person plural, make humanity in our image, b'tzelmutenu, after our likeness. The word cell can mean image, but it can also mean shadow. One of the joys of Hebrew is how flexible meanings are in Hebrew. And we're going to talk about more about God as a shadow or humanity as a shadow later. But, it raises the question, if we're created in God's image, what does it tell us about God? And what does it tell us about us? I'm going to pause to see if anybody wants to chime in on that. If the text says we're created in God's image, what does that tell you about humanity, and what does that tell you about God? See if anybody wants to chime in.
We have a God complex. We think we're gods.
We think, well, in some ways, we think we resemble God. So in what
Yeah,
ways
and
would you
God's
say,
imperfect.
say again?
Oh, if we're in God's image, then God is imperfect.
And God is imperfect? Is that what you said?
Sorry, if
that's what
we're
she
in his image,
Yeah, if we're in his image, then God is imperfect like we are.
because we're imperfect.
Yes. Or we are perfect in some way as God is.
Yeah.
Okay, because I think that this phrase tells us something about God and tells us something about us. Any other thoughts before we move on? We're going to talk more about this.
I like the idea of the shadow because, it's a resemblance, but it's not the full three-dimensional aspect of the totality of.
Yes, or it's a less dimensional aspect. I
Right.
don't remember if we ever talked about it. Anybody ever read the book Flatland by Abbott? No, anyway, it talks about two-dimensional creatures and three-dimensional creatures. Maybe we are a three-dimensional shadow of a 4 or 5 or zillion-dimensional God, but that's a whole other mathematical and question. The other interesting thing about this phrase is it's in the plural. Let us make humanity in our image. So the question is, who is God speaking to? The traditional answer is God is speaking to the heavenly host, a group of angels. That's traditional Jewish answer. Christians have no problem with this phrase at all because God is plural, basically Trinitarian. God was speaking to God's threefold self. And a more modern answer that I really like is God was talking to the animals and actually to the rest of creation. So God makes humanity on the 6th day and then said, let us make humanity in our image. And by the way, it says male and female, he created them. So in whose image? In the image of the animals, in the image of the rest of creation. I actually see this as a biblical proof text for evolution. God creates us from the existing evolutionary DNA world. So the question is, does God have an image? I would say most of us would immediately question this and say, no, God is a spirit. And actually, Maimonides focuses on this in the 10th century, just 1,000 years ago, really under Muslim influence. But in many places in the Bible, God is portrayed very anthropomorphically. Many people see God. God actually, there's a closing dinner right after the Torah is given. God and the 70 elders meet, have a meal, and it says that they actually saw God. The Hebrew phrase for getting angry, when God gets angry, the text is literally saying God's nose gets red. God takes us out of Egypt with an outstretched arm, and so on. So the philosophers like Maimonides say these are figures of speech, but the Kabbalists actually go overboard in the opposite direction. So I would say normative, rationalistic Judaism says we don't make an image of God because whatever image we would make would fall far short of what God actually is. The Kabbalists say sort of nonsense. Let's make dozens and dozens and hundreds of images of God. So here's an example, at least with dimension. There's a 6th century text called Shir Koma, and converting the units in that text to miles. God's feet are 105 million miles. Ankle to knees, you can see it there. Neck size, God's neck size is 455 million miles. The circumference of God's head is in the billions of miles. We have a length, a measure for God's beard, each finger, and even the black of God's eye. When I gave a talk on mysticism, I think I gave this sermon actually last high holidays. When I gave this in Texas, I calculated God's Stetson hat size, just for fun. So here is a phrase from the Torah that you all know. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai echad. We're going to talk about some of the calligraphy in a minute. Traditionally, this letter ayin and this letter daled are enlarged. But one of the characteristics of Hebrew is, again, flexibility and openness to interpretation. And here are just a couple of all valid translations. Adonai is now our God. Adonai will be one. Adonai alone. Adonai is one. One indivisible Adonai, a unique Adonai, an ultimate Adonai. And I think the Kabbalists are going to focus on this. Adonai is unity and everything. So some of Kabbalah is really coming out of this thought that God is the unity, the unifying principle of the universe. I actually have a book called The Meaning of Echad. There are 25 essays in this, and I sometimes like to think you probably can have 25 essays on every word in the Bible, but echad is actually a pretty interesting word in the Torah, and so there are lots and lots of essays, and your theology about God will focus on maybe which one of these meanings of echad you resonate with. And again, I will emphasize, traditionally, Jews weren't so interested in theology, namely, this is what you must believe about God. Jews were highly focused, I would say even obsessive compulsive, about what you're supposed to do, what you're supposed to eat, what you're not supposed to eat. When you pray, what do you say when you pray? How do you hang that funny little mezuzah on the wall? As we'll see later on, how you tie the talit, the prayer shawl. But belief, you can pretty much pick and choose. And of course, the first phrase in the second word, Shema Yisrael, listen, Israel. The word Yisrael, we get from the Bible when Jacob wrestles with an angel, which is also understood to be God, also a person, and gets his name changed from Yaakov, which means heel, because he was holding on to his brother's heel when a twin, was born, to Israel. And the word Israel means one who wrestles with God. And I often have this experience of someone coming up to me in a crisis and saying, you know what, I've got some real problems with this concept of God. And my response is, welcome to the club. We in this club actually name ourselves the God wrestlers. That's what we do. We wrestle with God. And this is in contrast with Islam, which in many ways is very similar to Judaism. Islam is actually closer to Judaism than either is to Christianity. But the word Islam means one who submits to God. So there's a very different stylistic attitude in our relationship with God. As Jews, we wrestle, we question, we struggle. Where in Islam, the ideal is to submit to the will of God. And again, if there are questions, chime in. So here is this would be a snapshot of what you would find in a Torah scroll or even in a mezuzah. And you can see the ayin and the daled in the Shema is enlarged. And so why are they enlarged? There are two explanations, or at least two I'll comment on right now. The word ayin daled means witness. And so one of the ideas is that this phrase is one of our witnessing statements to God. And so also the word, the ayin has no sound. So you might mix it up with a shin mem aleph rather than a shin mem ayin. But the word shin mem aleph, which in Aramaic is Shema, means perhaps. So we write the ayin large because we don't want you thinking we're saying perhaps God is one. And also the Daled is written large because, as you can see here, the Daled has a little overhang, but otherwise it looks a lot like a resh. And so if you didn't really focus on the shape of this letter, you might read it not as echad, but acher, which means another. And we certainly want to say another God. So again, even the calligraphy has messages, and this is all, very Kabbalistic. It's not just the meaning of the text, it's multiple meanings of the text, the shape of the letters, whether they are written large or small. We just go deeper and deeper and deeper. So the mystics, as I hinted at this before, understand echad to mean unity. So the phrase Adonai echad means God is unity. The idea that God is the ultimate unity in the universe. And this gets interesting. It says that everything is God and God is everything. The separations that we see amongst ourselves, you're separate people there, you're separate from each other, you're separate from the chair, you're separate from your clothing, you're separate from your automobiles. These are illusions. Just like a wave seems like it's separate from the sea, but it's really part of the sea. One of my teachers uses the tree as an image here. When we look at a tree, we might divide it into different elements. That there's the roots and the trunk and the branches and the twigs and the leaves. But as far as the tree is concerned, it's one tree. If you look at yourself, you might say, well, I have red blood cells, I have white blood cells, I have a kidney, I have a liver, I actually have a new thigh bone, which I had replaced about 10 weeks ago or so. And I don't know, is that now part of me, or is that not? That's an interesting question. Sure feels like part of me. It's working like it's part of me. Okay, so here's an experiment. When I count to 3, point to God without thinking a lot. 1, 2, 3, point. Okay. Okay, I'm not quite sure where you're pointing. At least some people pointed up. Some people pointed. Henry, where are you pointing?
I pointed at Belinda and
Okay.
And I pointed out myself and someone else, and Raisa.
Ardeen pointed to the word God.
Okay.
Wait,
So
us.
here are 2 valid images of the nature of God. In this image, God is somewhere up there, and I'm down here, and we're separated. So whenever we say a blessing, we say Baruch atah Adonai. Blessed are you, Adonai. Once I say you, Adonai, there's a you, Adonai, and there's a me down here, right? So in this phraseology, and we speak about God being in heaven, and you go up to the mountain to encounter God, and God, in the Bible, it has a dwelling place in the temple. So there's a separation. But the mystical image of God is more like this. In this image, God is everywhere, and everything indicated by the dashes. And here I am, or you are, and there's a separation, but the separation is an illusion. So in the mystical image, everything is God, and God is in everything and everywhere. Now, this is very nice if we're looking at waterfalls and flowers and so on, but there's a lot of horrible things in the world. So the mystic is going to contemplate the idea that God is in that too. So since they understand that everything is God and everything is under God's control and everything is just as it should be, that things are going just as God intends it. Yeah, there's a hand in the back. I can barely see you, but you might want to come forward so I can hear you.
Yeah.
I have a question about, how, I'm not saying they're the same because I don't want to be blasphemous, but how is that, or is that different than like what some people believe about like animism, like God is in everything and, every
Yes.
creation? I mean, can you explain that?
Yeah,
please?
so I would say the difference is the Jewish concept is one God who is everywhere and everything but communicates to us, rather than the God of the trees, the God of the waterfalls, which might be separate gods, or just a God of nature. One interesting issue, which I might touch upon, is this idea of spirituality. If I'm sort of a and I don't want to abuse the notion, just like you don't want to be blasphemous. I don't want to be insulting to New Age spirituality. I go out into, into what is it? Yosemite is in your area, right? I go to
Yeah.
Yosemite. I see these incredibly beautiful sights of nature. I feel at one with nature. I feel spiritual. I feel blessed. And now the question is, then what? Has that encounter with nature made any requirements on me? The thing I like about religious spirituality, I'm not limiting this to Judaism, is it makes requirements on me. There are strings tied. I would say the strings of the tzitzit and the talit are tied to your encounters with nature and every other thing. Yes, I've been given a gift from God. Now what? Now what? I have to take care of God's children because I've just gotten a gift. I have to acknowledge the gift and I have to share the gift with others. Whereas just pure spirituality, I feel wonderful, mazel tov, so what? So again, I don't know so much about animism, whether that's a helpful way of addressing your question.
Thank you.
Okay. So this idea that God is in control of everything and it's going just as it should be, again, as my teacher, when I refer to my teacher, I'm usually thinking of Rabbi Larry Kushner, if you know who he is, not to be confused with Harold Kushner. And as he points out, this is a theology that you don't bring anywhere near a hospital. You don't tell, the mother of a child that now has been diagnosed with cancer is that this is really God's will. It says that the cancer, the accident, even the war, Holocaust gas chambers are under the control and will of God. I have great problems with this. I recently heard a Kabbalist speaking who says it's not quite this simple. And there is, some of you who know a little physics know about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. If you know about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, wave at me. No.
Heard of it?
Sorry?
I've heard of it.
Okay. Well, according to this scholar, there's a theological uncertainty principle, but I'm going to leave that to some future date. So the central text of Jewish mysticism is the Zohar. Here's a title page. It says Sefer HaZohar. Here is a collection of texts, and here's a modern translation, which I'll comment on. It's a work of pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigrapha, an English word, believe it or not, is the opposite of plagiarism. In plagiarism, you copy someone else's work and you claim it as your own. In pseudepigrapha, you write something and you claim somebody else wrote it. So why would anyone do that? The answer is, if I write a little booklet, I actually did write a little booklet and it sold like 5,000 copies. But if I found the booklet and published it and claimed it was really written by Moses, or I don't know, any of the ancients, that would arouse a lot of interest. So the scholars say that the Zohar was actually written in the 13th century. This is Common Era, so about 700 years ago, in Spain by Moshe de Leon or his school. And we know this because by studying the text carefully, we can see even some medieval Spanish words creeping in. But the way it is written, it's written in 2nd century Aramaic, and it claims to be written by Shimon Bar Yochai, who is a character from the Mishnah living in this time. And it's a tale of a rabbi traveling throughout the Galilee with his disciples. By the way, does that idea sound familiar to anyone? A rabbi traveling? Yes, because this is written in a time of astounding anti-Jewish anti-Semitism by the Catholic Church. So lo and behold, we have a story of our own rabbi traveling through the Galilee with disciples. It is structured as a commentary on the Torah. Remember, I said for Judaism, spirituality means digging deeply into the text. So the Zohar is a mystic interpretation of the Bible, of the Torah. And as I said, we read of a brilliant rabbi 2,000 years ago wandering the Galilee. And it provides a structure and a practice of Kabbalah. It introduces the 10 Sefirot, which is very difficult. I think I read this in the sermon I gave on mysticism for high holidays. I'll just read it quickly. So this is a commentary on the moment of creation. At the head of the potency of the king, he engraved engravings in luster on high. A spark of impenetrable darkness flashed within the concealed of the concealed from the head of infinity. A cluster of vapor forming in formlessness, thrust in a ring, not white, not black, not red, not green, no color at all. As a cord surveyed, it yielded radiant colors. Deep within the spark gushed a flow, splaying colors below, concealed within the concealed of the mystery of Ein Sof. It split and did not split. Its aura was not known at all until under the impact of splitting, a single concealed supernal point shone. Beyond this point, nothing is known, so it is called Reshit, beginning. And this modern translation is accompanied by 3 pages of 13 footnotes. So if you thought this was going to be easy, as we say in the old country, forget about it. This is really quite difficult material, and it's written in Aramaic. Not even Hebrew, without vowels, and so on. This is a chart that at least you should be familiar with. How many of you have seen this kind of chart before relating to Kabbalah? So this is the Sefirot. So actually, if you look over here, if God created us in the divine image, then in some sense, God is structured like a person. So the Sefirot has, in some sense, the image of God. There is at the top, there's a keter, which means crown. There's a right side and a left side. I know it's a little hard to read, but there's a phallus, yesod, and then there is Shekhinah at the bottom. The Shekhinah is the presence of God in the world, and it's feminine. And I have a class also in that Jewish mysticism page about Jewish legends, Jewish mythology, and the mythology of the Shekhinah as the bride of God is absolutely fascinating, and it's very sexual. So stuff you would never think would be in Jewish thought. So you have this material. I've been through it dozens of times, and I only have the beginnings of understanding this deeply. So I'm not going to dwell on it because we'll be here all night if we try to dwell on it. And then it gets even deeper. So here's Bina. Yeah, one of the basic ideas is you have Keter, which is the crown, and above the crown, I don't know, it's not even mentioned here. There's something called Ein Sof. There's nothing, about which nothing is known. And then you have the crown, and the crown produces a point, which you might think of as a bit of sperm, an initial thing. That's actually what was being discussed in the moment that we read from the Zohar. And then that point, which is male, gets implanted in the Bina. And the Bina is like the divine womb. And then that gives birth to the 7 lower Sefirot. So there's a lot of mythology. And, I always take this poetically, not to be taken literally, but I believe that there are Kabbalists that actually take this material literally. And there's a right side and a left side, and a right leg and left leg. And there's chesed on one side, which is loving kindness. And there's strength and judgment on the other side, which is more God's aspect of justice. So again, digging deeply into the nature of God. Okay, I want to now jump to the subject of, again, drawing secrets out from the text. You probably have heard that Jews give like in units of 18. Does this sound familiar to people? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Why 18? Because, again, as I mentioned, here's the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. There are 22 of them. The first 10 are the numbers 1 through 10. The 11th one is 20, and we get up as high as 400, not higher. Okay? And this is one system. There are probably a dozen or two different systems. which are, you know, the squares, the sums of the squares. I mean, if you can think of it algebraically, the rabbis developed the system. So why do we give in terms of 18? Well, chet is 8, chet is 8, and yud is 10. So chet and yud together are 18, and it spells chai, and there is chai means life. Everybody get that?
Yes.
Okay, that's why we do things in 18. But I want to spend a moment on, more than a moment, on the gematria and the secrets of the talit. So the traditional way you tie a talit is you make a double knot. Here's, let's say, the corner of a page, or in this case, or of a sheet of paper to practice, or the corner of your talit. You tie a double knot, and then you wind around 7 times, another knot, then 8 times, another knot, then 11 times, another knot, then 13 times, and the final knot. Okay? Everybody with me on that? And that is the traditional way. I would say if you looked at a talit, I know there are probably some there, this is what you would see. There are alternative ways to tie a talit, but this is the pretty much the Ashkenazi standard. And here's just a bunch of varieties of ways of tying it. And I don't really know much. I just found this on actually at Ben's Talit shop. And so you can look up old Ben's Talit shop and order the blue thread. And there's lots of different ways of tying it. So what's up with this crazy bit of macrame? So first of all, the gematria of the word tzitzit. The tzadi is 90, the yud is 10, the tzadi is 90, another yud, and the tuf is 400. That gives us 600. But we have 5 knots in the talit, and there are 8 strings in each tzitzit, I should say. Therefore, if I add up the numerical value of the word tzitzit and the number of knots and the number of strings, I get 613 total for the 613 mitzvot. But wait, there's more. If you order before midnight, I can reveal the following additional secrets. The first group of 7 is the number of days of creation. The second group, 8, is the number of days in Brit Milah, in a that you wait for a circumcision. It symbolizes wholeness because you've experienced at least one Shabbat, you've been through a week, and now you're starting the second week. So the sum of the first 2 groups is 15, which is the gematria of the first 2 letters of God's actual name, Yud He Vav He. Yud is 10, He is 5. The third group, 11, is the gematria of the last 2 letters of God's name. Vav is 6, He is 5, so that's 11. And the fourth group, 13, is the gematria of the word echad. Aleph is 1, chet is 8, and daled is 4. So the total number of windings is equal to Adonai echad. So every time we look at a tzitzit, we not only are reminded of the 613 commandments, but of the unity of God. And the word echad also, Aleph is 1, the 1 talit, chet is 8, the 8 strings in each tzitzit, and 4 are the 4 corners of the talit. And there's probably a lot more if I went into a deep study of this. By the way, the Sephardim, instead of 7, 8, 11, and 13, have 10, 5, 6, Yud, He, 10, 5, 6, 5 for Yud, He, Vav, He, God's actual name. Okay, but even the shapes of the letters have mystical significance. So consider the Hebrew word for truth, emet. It's very stable. Each letter has a firm base, at least in this font, which I have chosen. And it's very stable. By the way, Aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Taf is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And Mem is the middle letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So you can't imagine a more stable word or concept than truth. Now the second word to consider is sheker, which means lie. The shin is wobbling. The kaf is off balanced and poised on a toe, and the resh is also off balanced and poised on a toe. And by the way, these are the 3 next to last letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So even the shapes of the letters have mystical significance. In any discussion of Kabbalah, we have to talk about Isaac Luria. Luria lived in the 1500s. He and his family were expelled from Spain. The expulsion from Spain was in 1492. He died in Sfat. Only 2.5 years. He taught in Sfat for 2.5 years before dying in an epidemic. He is called Ha'ari, which means the Ashkenazi Rabbi Yitzchak. It's a abbreviation for his name, and it also means the lion. He taught almost nothing, but his students recorded his teachings. So here is the basic idea of Lurrianic Kabbalah. In the beginning, before the beginning of the beginning, there was nothing, only God. Okay? The entire universe is all God and only God. And now God decides to create a physical universe, which in a way is an interesting question in itself. I always like to ask people, why do they think God decided to create a physical universe? Why wasn't God happy with just occupying everything all by God's self? Any thoughts?
Yeah, right.
No?
Loneliness.
Sorry?
Loneliness.
Loneliness. Yeah, so one answer I like. The answer I don't like, which is a traditional answer, is if God is to be praised and glorified, God needs somebody to praise and glorify God. Okay, it's sort of an egocentric version of the reason to create a universe. The idea of loneliness relates to the idea that God likes stories, and God basically wants company. God is intimately involved with creation. So the idea here is something which is called in Hebrew and in this Lurrianic Kabbalah, tzimtzum. God creates the same way many of you ladies who have had children create, namely with contractions. So God creates not by contracting in, but by withdrawing. So the idea is tzimtzum. God withdrew from a spot. Here's the spot. Here's God withdrawing. And God pours divine light into that area where a universe is to be created. And this is kind of an interesting image. If you could read the Hebrew, I know it's really small on the outside. Well, here's Ein Sof without end, and then Keter, the first Sefirot, and Chachma, and Bina, and Chesed, and so on. So God is pouring light into vessels that are the Sefirot. And I can't remember what I have in the next slide. Where did this happen? Jewish tradition teaches it happened right here. You probably are familiar with this spot. It's called the Dome of the Rock. So, a simple question is, what is inside the Dome of the Rock? How many of you guessed a rock? You can stay after class and clean the erasers. Yeah, there's a big rock. This is actually a picture of inside the rock. In Muslim tradition, this is a holy place, because in Muslim tradition, this is where Muhammad began his night journey to the heavens. In Jewish tradition, this is the top of Mount Moriah, where Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac. But also in Jewish mystical tradition, it's called the Even HaShtiyah, the foundation stone. And lo and behold, there's actually a cave. You can actually walk down these stairs and stand in the center of the place where God created the universe. And it was an amazing moment when I was there. During my year in Israel, things were relatively peaceable and you could go there. And I was there with my wife for some time. And I would stand for hours. They didn't want me to sit down. I couldn't pray in here, but I would spend just hours inside this place. Lurrianic Kabbalah has a very interesting feature, which is called Shevirat Kelim, the breaking of the vessels. So the idea is when God created vessels to hold the divine light, God pours the divine light into these vessels, and God gets carried away, either deliberately or not. I've never had a Kabbalist make this absolutely clear to me, but the vessels shatter, And the result is a universe that needs repair. You've probably heard the word tikkun olam. In this context, it means the repair of everything, and specifically the repair of these vessels. The divine light scatters into the universe, but because it's so holy, it creates a protective covering to protect the universe from the divine light. And every time in Jewish tradition, a Jew does a mitzvah, a little bit of the universe is healed and a holy spark is released. In this sense, Judaism is very Jewish centric. Even though we're only 0.2% of the world's population, the ultimate repair of the universe depends on us doing mitzvot. No pressure here, but you know who you are, you know what you're doing or not doing. So for me, one of the most astonishing insights of Kabbalah is that God cannot repair the universe without our help. Call it tikkun olam. It certainly is the centerpiece of Reform Judaism, and thus it's our efforts as God's partner that are required to bring about redemption and the Messiah. God is simply incapable of doing this work by God's self. So in Kabbalistic thought, the role of certainly of Jews, I would say broader of humanity, in making the world more like the one God has in mind is central. And this is also exemplified in the Hebrew word for angel, which is malach, but it's also the same as the Hebrew word for messenger. So basic Jewish thought, God sends us into the world to do God's work, to make the world more like the one God has in mind. And are we simple messengers or divine angels speaking Hebrew? There is no difference. We are agents of God. So getting back to this idea that Henry likes, and so do I, which is being God's shadow. So one understanding that is that we are created in God's shadow. So here's a picture of shadows. Can you tell anything about what the thing that's causing these shadows are doing from just looking at the shadow?
Playing with their kid.
Sorry, say again?
Playing with their kid.
Yes, they're playing with the kid. And if I see the shadow doing something, can I be absolutely certain that the thing causing the shadow is also doing that thing?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So the shadow and its source are deeply linked. So we get the idea, the mystical idea, that we, as God's shadow, force God's hands by our action. So by making harmony on earth, we make harmony in the heavens. And I would add, when we do good things inspired by God and God's teachings, we bring God into the world. Feeding the hungry, visiting the sick. When I visit someone in a hospital and comfort them, they have no doubt that God is present comforting them. And in a sense, when I do this work, I am forcing God to be in that room by being God's shadow in that room. And by the way, it doesn't matter whether God actually exists in some kind of metaphysical or spiritual sense. If we are feeding the hungry, if we are making peace, if we're making the world a better, cleaner, more loving, more happy, more caring place, then, and particularly if we're doing that at the inspiration of these teachings, then God has actually done it, leaving, to philosophers or theologians, the question of whether God actually exists. And I remember teaching this one time about, and as I was doing this teaching, it was on a high holiday, and there was a woman in the congregation who I know had just lost her husband. And it occurred to me to take this to the end of life. So when does a shadow disappear? There's a hand with a shadow. The shadow disappears when the causer of the shadow and the shadow become one. So it's, in a sense, death being the shadow, then us become one and deeply connected to God. Another question that gets asked all the time about, which is, what do Jews believe about the afterlife? I think I have 3 classes on that same page on my website. And my usual simple answer is, I don't know what Jews believe about the afterlife. Go ask them. We can talk about what Judaism teaches about the afterlife, but what individual Jews believe is another question. And by the way, Judaism teaches that there is one. A mainstay of Jewish teaching is in physical resurrection, namely that our souls rejoin our reconstituted body in the day of the coming of the Messiah. There's also, Kabbalah is centrally focused on the idea of reincarnation, that our souls come back in a different body to continue work and service of God. And there's also a lot of discussion in the Talmud and other places about communication between worlds, that the living and the dead can communicate. And I know, Henry, you show up a lot for my teaching. I'm thinking of doing a class on that, of what the Talmud says about communication, because there's some really fun and interesting stories about that.
That'd be great.
Okay, so moving toward the conclusion of this, steps to becoming more spiritual. First, blessings and prayer. The traditional blessings of Judaism are twofold. They are thanks for the good stuff blessing. You have a bit of bread, you say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lecha min haaretz. And then, if you're fulfilling a mitzvah, you add the words after Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. You say, Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotov v'tzivanu, who has made us holy with commandments and commands us to put on a talit, light Shabbat candles, light Hanukkah candles, and so on. And we have a whole series, and I know I talked about this during the high holidays, of fixed liturgical prayer, not because God needs our prayer, but because we need to pray together. And there's also a tradition, and I know I talked about this too, of just sitting and speaking quietly to God and speaking the deepest truths and longings of your heart, and not to interrupt yourself by wondering whether there really is a God, or whether God is really listening, but just pouring your heart out to God and then listening for a response. And I always say there's two possibilities. One is that there really is a God, and God is going to respond to our prayers and our thoughts. Remember, the word is Shema, listen, Israel. Two is there is no God, but you're pouring out the deepest longings and thoughts of your heart, and that's not chopped liver. That's significant. So I can tell you my own experience, this has been life-changing, just talking to God. I'm pretty sure I talked about this too very briefly on the high holidays. Another element of being more spiritual is seeing the holy in the world. So the example here is you go into a supermarket, and if you're not focused, you're in a hurry, prices are expensive, you're wondering, are you going to get home in time for whatever? But now just think about, in a world where I think only something like 40% of the world have clean water to drink, in a world where historically people were always on the edge of starvation and certainly didn't have abundant, clean, healthy food, here it is. This food is laid out for you. I can't remember what pictures I have. Yeah, so things are neatly organized. The cans are there. They're lined up. I always like to say you go over to where the produce is, and it gets spritched. And if you're really in a high class supermarket, every now and again there'll be thunder, so the broccoli really thinks it's still growing in the fields, and it's actually raining. And then I know I mentioned this, and the mysticism. Coin a new phrase, the mysticism of mustard. If I didn't have any mustard at all, I could be very happy. And if I only had deli mustard, Diana, it's enough for me. So I think I mentioned how many choices of mustard I found one day in preparing a sermon. And the answer is 39 different choices of mustard at a local sort of high-class supermarket, Gelson's, the fine grain and the coarse grain, and Dijon and French's, and so on. And then I think I talked about last time also God's gift of olive oil. When I went to do the sermon again, I couldn't use mustard, so I had to come up with something different. So I went to Whole Foods Market, and anybody remember how many different, or want to guess how many choices of olive oil?
It was over 100, wasn't it?
It was 92. And I usually talk about, well, probably if I went back, it would be over 100. And I always talk about, you know, flavored and spiced and virgin and extra virgin. I have yet to find slutty, olive oil. So, and then, you know, there's a tradition, and I'm not going to tell the whole story of Ruvain and Shimon, and they were there at the splitting of the sea, and they only looked down, and all they saw was mud, and they were complaining that they're tired of walking and their sandals are caught in the mud and nothing good ever happens to us. And first it was dry desert, and now we're walking in mud. And the story of Ruvain and Shimon is they completely missed the miracle. So as these guys say, make sure you stop a second, Moses, and realize how amazingly cool this is. We are surrounded by miracles, and the trick is to notice them. So step number 2 is seeing the holy in the world. Notice the miracles in your life. Notice that you've been blessed. The thank you, God, for these gifts is to share your blessings with God's children. And a gift without acknowledgement is a theft. My teacher, again, Larry Kushner, said, if after a Shabbat service, everyone goes home feeling wonderful and happy and fulfilled and terrific, we've missed the point. People should go home feeling grateful for the gifts in their life, but feeling anxious because it's going to be until the next sunset that we can go out and start actually working on the world to make it a better place. And then step number 3 is religious New Year's resolutions. Take on one new spiritual practice each year. It may be prayer. It may be something in dietary practice. It may, you know, not be full kashrut, but you might want to, you know, move away from pork or shellfish, or be vegetarian. And, you know, a phrase I learned both as a management consultant and as a rabbi is, don't let the best be the enemy of the good. Simply because you can't do everything perfectly, don't avoid doing something. And then I think most powerfully is seeing yourself as God's hands, moving your prayer from give me, you know, if I do this, God's going to give me something, to teach me and help me, and then use me in the mystic idea, not the magic idea. You are God's shadow, so bring God with you wherever you go. Isaiah, the prophet, quotes God as saying, you are my witnesses and I am God. The rabbis say this means God can only be God if we are witnesses. If we don't do God's work in the world, then God becomes irrelevant. Again, the mystical idea is God cannot do work in the world. God doesn't work miracles in the world. God sends us as messengers, malachim, angels, to do God's work in the world. We're just almost at the end. This isn't bad at all. So some suggested reading. I have a lot more on my website. This is a wonderful book. This would actually be fun to do. Oh, maybe we'll do this, Greg. Here's an idea. Yom Kippur afternoon. We can have, no, I may forget this, but hopefully I won't. This is a very small book. It's called Kabbalah, a Love Story. It's by Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, a Reform rabbi, and, you know, a real scholar of Kabbalah. He wrote books on Kabbalah are not easy. Big surprise, right? I think I have behind me somewhere around 120 and 130 books on Kabbalah, and they are not easy. This one is wonderful because it's a love story. And it works on about 6 different levels, which I love about it, and some really interesting symbolism. So here's an idea for Yom Kippur afternoon. A session we'll read and discuss this book. How does that sound? I think that I've always wanted to do this. I've never done it. I've never done it here. When I finally got the meaning of the book, or at least what I interpret as the meaning of the book, the next time I saw Larry Kushner, I kissed him because it was just so brilliant. And then there's another one, the Jewish Light Spirituality Handbook, one by Daniel Matt. You know, I talked about the Zohar. The Zohar is a very complicated book. There are some translations, and until Daniel Matt undertook his translation, all the translations were terrible. Because it's confusing enough just to translate it. Imagine just trying to live with the thing we read without all the footnotes. And Daniel Matt's a scholar of Kabbalah and the Zohar. And someone asked him, and this was probably 25 years ago, what's a good translation into English of the Zohar? And he said, there really isn't one. And he said, well, the woman said to him, why don't you work on it? And he said, it would take me 20 years and a team of scholars, and it would cost a small fortune to do it. And she said, I will underwrite it. And so he does now have 12 volumes. I don't know if it's the complete Zohar, but it's very good. And these are snippets of it, the Essential Kabbalah, which is a good collection. And the most important thing is not only is it translated into the English, but there's also a lot of footnotes to help you understand what's going on. And if you're looking for a very short introduction, here is a book called Kabbalah, A Very Short Introduction. And that's it.
Cool.
So,
Rabbi, question for you.
Yes.
Kushner's book.
Yes.
You said we do it on you before. If we did, would it be beneficial or not if we did like a book club in here and like read it?
Yes.
I mean, it's $12 on Amazon.
Yes.
If it's something we want to do, and
Yeah. What I've never led a book club reading of a book. I'm not even sure how to do it, to be honest with you, but I bet that we have some skilled people maybe in your congregation or in your room. So one possibility is assign that for Yom Kippur. And I guess people can even share the book if that's an issue. Or another thing is to have a book club and we can do something on Zoom. I really don't know, but it is a wonderful book. It is. I'm going to grab it. Hang on a second.
Yeah.
Or either just be bored and do something like don't. What?
It is.
Versus my dad.
It is a small book. This is it. Okay. It's not big. And as you know, mine is filled with notes, and I even have, and actually I can probably send you, there's even, what is this? Oh, that's a sermon. I think I even found a discussion questions that I think Larry Kushner actually posted.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And I'm sure I found it on the internet, but I can certainly,
So you can
certainly
share those with us.
yeah, I'd be happy to share them with you. So either we can do that as a high holiday thing, or we can have a separate book club. I am open to whatever makes sense. It is a wonderful book, but it is, like everything we've talked about, much deeper than the simple meaning. The simple meaning is actually the intermingling of two love stories, one going on in Manhattan, probably in, I don't know, the 80s or 80s or 90s. And the other love story is going on in Spain around the time the Zohar is being written. And they intertwine and connect, and it's fantastic. So yeah, I think that would be really fun to do, either for high holidays or just as a book club. So that's the end of my slides. So I'll just open the floor for questions, comments. If not, I will leave you to your Super Bowl preparations.
This was really interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know
It
if you can
really
hear.
was.
Yeah.
Very informative.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, and again, if you want to, I don't know what else I covered, but I have a 3-session version of this on my website. And I will be posting what we just did today also on the website, so other folks can listen in. So, and I'll also be posting it on my own YouTube channel. And again, I have, I think you know this, I think probably one of you or more of you are on my mailing list. I have classes almost every Monday night and every Wednesday night. We are into a deep, careful reading of the book of Job on Monday nights, and we're right in the middle of it. So that will be continuing. What is it? Saturday night? Yeah, that'll be this Monday. And Wednesday night, we're going to be discussing the talit and the tzitzit, and I'll be covering actually some of the same material I covered tonight. So again, thank you for
Great.
virtually inviting me. And I know I
Thank
will
you.
be seeing you again in person sometime in the spring to
Hopefully, yeah.
dedicate a Torah. And there's some great traditions of this about bringing the Torah in under a chuppah. I don't remember if I discussed this with you, Greg. There's a tradition of bringing the Torah in under a chuppah, and I have chuppah poles which I can bring and a huge talit.
Cool.
So we can do a dedication, and then I would
Yeah,
hope,
we like
Henry,
that.
we can complete your conversion on that
Awesome.
weekend as well, sometime
Great.
this spring.
Yeah. Cool.
And then high holidays, God willing, Bezrat Hashem, with God's help.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so again, thank you all, and have a good weekend, and
Yeah.
Thank
you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
I'll see you when I see you. Take care.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right, have a great night.
Thank you.
Night.
Good night. Good night, Ann.
Thank you.